Age of Charlemagne has almost become a go-to response for quality DLC, but the success of this expansion extends past it just being a polished piece of content. It was a story of CA listening to the fans, taking a huge risk, and both parties benefiting, keeping this underappreciated title relevant even in 2021. Welcome to Elven Plot Armor, and today we are going through numbers, modelling, and a little bit of educated speculation to explore the history of Total War Attila and how Age of Charlemagne saved it. Now, before we dive into the infamous expansion, I'd like to take us back to February 2015. Game of Thrones was still good, and it had been nearly 2 years since Rome 2's shaky release, which is finally fading into memory thanks to a persistent slate of favourable DLC, and the game maintaining roughly the same player base it had since its first 6 months, which is pretty damn impressive, averaging around 11,500 with maybe 13,000 on a good month. The Creative Assembly had also enjoyed further success with 2014's Alien Isolation, and anything they released regarding the Roman Empire, we just seemed to lap right up. There's an argument on whether Attila should have been an expansion, but it's clear there was interest and an audience for a release dedicated to the decline of the Roman Empire. We're going to keep coming back to these visual aids, but what I want to make clear here is that Rome's concurrent players looked like this from its release till the next installment, and you do need to know that a typical release does enjoy a huge surge, but this steadies out around the 3-month mark. As we can see here, Rome has been impressively steady in the entire year leading up to it. But first, let's just look through the eyes of an average player prior to release. This is Rome 2. Look at its map bursting with colours, factions, cultures, religions, and possibility. Yes, Rome 2 was an easy game, but most new players could pick it up and be absorbed by the Republic and slog their way through the campaign as Rome and feel like a Roman badass while doing it. I know fun is a subjective word, but Rome 2 was fun. Look at the amount of people coming back for more. And just a bit of speculation on my side, I think it's because the grand campaign had so many possibilities. In February 2015, Total War released to a strong landing of 14,500 players, and although this would be the only ever instance, it managed to beat Rome 2 by 1,000 players. So it's also worth mentioning Rome 2 had a banger month as well, but things were off to a great start. So you've just installed Total War Attila and you jump into a new campaign and the game positions you on the choice of Attila. So maybe you chose the titular Huns as your first campaign. And why not? This was the debut of the brand new Horde mechanic. The Horde mechanic has become a mainstay of the Total War landscape, but to be honest, it's about as far from classic Total War as you can get. So this was definitely going to be beloved by some players and maybe not for others. Personally, I do enjoy the old Horde campaign, but either way, there still exists a sentiment in the community that Horde campaigns lack the replayability of their settled counterparts, meaning prolonged gameplay would hinge even heavier on the traditional Total War factions if this game was going to enjoy its sustained interest. So you've finished your Hunnic campaign, your next campaign is most likely to see how the settled factions live. Now there's another major faction which people probably skipped the Huns and went straight to. Who might that be? I'll give you a hint. Creative Assembly have already named 2 entire games. Yes, of course it's Rome. There have been several videos dedicated as to why Attila failed, but no one seems to mention what seems so obvious in my eyes is that the most definitive faction in all of Total War is simply a god-awful experience in Attila, and it's going to be very unpleasant for a casual's first game. Stay with me here. I'd like to preface that there is a big difference between enjoyable challenge and tedious, painful grinding. I personally love Total Warhammer 2 on Legendary difficulty. Yes, it's not perfect, but it provides me with immersive challenge with suspense and difficult decisions. And I'm a player that loves overcoming challenge with an immersive campaign that in this case I would like to be historically accurate so I can attempt to try and save the Roman Empire. And let's clarify here, the East and particularly the Western empires should be difficult uphill battles. This is after all where Theodosius passes the empire onto his 2 idiot sons, and particularly the West is crumbling to pieces under the worst emperor in its history, fast tracking it into the ground. The idea of changing history by having Stilicho assassinate Honorius and create my own fantasy where the Goths weren't provoked into sacking Rome, well, just listen to me, this game had me at hello. I've seen arguments implying that if players were pushed to maybe the smaller barbarian factions, they would have had a different experience, but in my personal opinion, that is not acceptable. Many players were skilled enough at Rome 2 and enthralled by the faction to see how the story ends. And difficulty was never going to dissuade some people. What players would find would be a campaign so focused on raising and ensuring large empires fall that even a skilled Rome 2 player was almost destined to walk into Attila and have a hard time thanks to a raft of double-edged mechanics that turn the grind up to 11. My own speculation here is that I think almost so much emphasis was put on ensuring Rome crumbles apart with the appropriate mechanics, there was no real thought on how to make this enjoyable, even for a skilled Rome 2 player. I mean, a common strategy to cope with using the Roman empires is to essentially encourage the player to abandon much of their territory, raise their neighbour's territory, and burn down all their churches. Yes, you heard me. Trust me, you're going really against the grain here by not adopting a small handful of ridiculous strategies that would get any Roman assassinated in minutes. I'll get back to the numbers in just a second, but just for those who have never played Attila, I'm going to quickly run over the biggest sources of issues in this game, which sources from the civil management systems, which are just designed to cascade in a way which compounds and makes recovery so tedious you'll regret ever making a creative decision. For example, you can put your generals in offices. Great, but if you promote them in the wrong order or they win too many battles, their loyalty can crash and they can have a civil war. There's also a separate mechanic called integrity, which can fall just by ransoming troops, and if that hits 0, well, you guess. Any civil wars create a global public order penalty, and that might cause another revolt which attacks another settlement, which even if you win, automatically damages buildings, attracting a devastation penalty to public order, which causes more revolts in other provinces, and the rebels will just raze that settlement to the ground, causing immigration public order penalties in surrounding provinces for another civil war, and you get where I am going here. And I haven't even touched on Attila's sanitation mechanic here. Rome 2 combined this with squalor, which had to be managed, and this was a simple, effective way of curbing their players' scale without drawing too much attention from the more interesting aspects of the game. Attila's addition of sanitation merely reduces the choice and makes every province look identical because you have to span the same handful of buildings lest you face a compounding cocktail of plagues, unrest, and mutinies. The knock-on effect is Attila's building system is hamstrung by its mechanics, and it becomes an uncreative system of just choosing between which building hurts you the least. And that's the source of grind in Attila, is that nothing ever feels like progress, it's just avoiding regression, and there's never any satisfying feeling of growth. Attila's governors were an exciting RPG element, but you only get a couple of them and you spend more time managing their loyalty and integrity than looking at equipment for them. And I'll add right here that guess what high loyalty and integrity do? Nothing. Again, all this work to avoid disaster and never gaining any real reward. It's like the choice of being punched in one nut or both nuts, but hey, you get the choice, right? Attila's mechanics were so focused around making large empires unsustainable, they overlooked the shortcoming that these unforgiving mechanics strip the player of creativity. And then the result is that this Raze heavy, obsessed AI burns many cities to the ground. Even a revolt will just often burn a city to the ground, and given how expensive and slow building is, yes, that's just another source of tedium. And because of all the aforementioned public order issues, you often will just opt to raze your enemy neighbours rather than take them over, which means the player is incentivized to make the campaign map even more bare and boring before Attila even shows up. Add in the majority of factions are hordes and will run and sail away from you so you can't wipe them up, and the sense of progress is really fleeting. I'd like to preface that as someone absolutely enamored with this time period, I want this to be my favourite campaign, but it is just such a grind. So here we are, a game with the titular Huns, which are a one then done campaign, the Eastern Roman Empire whose best tactic is to burn its churches and not spend money, and a Western Roman revolt simulator. After bearing this game for so long, I'd like to add that in 2021 this game can be modded into an enjoyable experience. Now I promise I'm done ragging on Attila. I just wanted to make clear what a history nerd fanboy's experience personally was like to maybe help paint a picture, but what do the concurrent player numbers say? Well, expect that launch hype to flatten out a bit, but by the end of the first 3 months, Attila had fallen to 28% of its player base at launch, 10% worse than Rome despite its launch. Yes, Attila is getting its tail kicked by Rome 2 at launch time. Yikes. Moreover, in this initial period, Attila had received 2 DLCs, and the combination of Rome 2 and Attila's player base was essentially a good month for Rome 2 before Attila even came along. So whatever combination of Attila players were reverting back to Rome 2 or leaving altogether, the title had not grown the fan base for modern Total War. When putting this video together, this moment really highlighted to me just how important the Grand Campaign is in terms of replayability, but also how it establishes the trust in future DLC. By May 15, both Attila and Rome 2's combined player base had decreased to a combined 11,500 players. If that rings a bell, that was the average number for Rome 2 in the year prior. I'd just like to speculate here that at the end of the third quarter meeting, I do wonder if Rome 2's DLC had been above budget and they'd possibly inflated their projections for Attila pre-release. It's standard practice to revise forecasts based on current sales trajectories, and it wouldn't have been outlandish to increase the budgeted sales for Attila given the sustained interest and success of Rome 2. CA would post solid profits and returns for this year, but I'm curious to see if the plan was to release their first massive DLC in the new financial year, but instead we saw it in June, which perhaps was to try and inflate Attila's performance and make the most recent product look better for the 2014 and 15 financial year. June 2015's DLC was The Last Roman, and it was a must-play for me, playing as Belisarius, one of Rome's greatest generals, and successfully reconquering the Western Empire only to have the Black Death send the Empire back into oblivion before it could consolidate. It took on a unique narrative campaign structure, and the lead campaign was an expedition, so far away from the settled campaign and the vices that came with that, so this was a really great idea. The problem is that once again, like Horde factions, it lacked replayability. And whether or not this DLC was rushed out or not, it only resulted in a slight bump in players for June and July, and it could not stem the leak to hit a record low of players in August. Attila would enjoy a slight bump of a few hundred players with the release of its Empire Sands DLC, another underrated piece of content in my eyes, but since its launch for the rest of 2015, the combined player base of Rome 2 and Attila would sit around that 11,500 players, of which between 30 to maybe 35% were Attila, and by November 2015, 10 months after release, Attila would fall below 3,000 concurrent players. Attila was in a bad way, and this is just my subjective opinion. I don't think it was down to the content. The choice of the Grand Campaign factions from the Huns, the Saxons, the Franks, Picts, having a unique Western and Eastern Empire, these were all awesome choices, and there were some great units in there, as well as some of the best sieges in the entire series, even at 2021. The flaw was in the mechanics and how we experienced that content. Just the double-edged nature of every mechanic meant the player was more focused on not making a mistake and railroaded into monotony of blandness rather than having the creativity and freedom they experienced in Rome 2. Players weren't sticking around, and it looked like Attila at this point might just be remembered as Rome 2's sadistic little brother that no one wanted to be around. But amidst all this, CA had listened to all the disdain towards the Grand Campaign and aimed to put its finger on what made Rome 2 and maybe where they went too far with Attila. They had one more card to play that would change Attila's fortunes, a back-to-basics Grand Campaign that would go back to the fundamentals of empire building, bring in new mechanics, while addressing the vast majority of issues with the main campaign. In 2015, November, Age of Charlemagne was announced, and it would wake up the Attila player base with a new campaign set around the 8th century and its titular figure, Charlemagne. An interview with the developers around their goal was to center the campaign around Charlemagne's conquest and the rebirth of the world, as opposed to the death and destruction of the core game. It would adopt the narrative elements of The Last Roman, but evolve them to avoid the limited and linear paths that it forced the player on, instead offering more pathways and not just with the campaign story. For example, like in real life, Charlemagne's brother Carloman dies, but he has 4 choices, not just 2, and they range from marching on Paris to seize the throne, as well as allowing independence. Also, these story beats take on a far more positive approach. You can see your empire change from the kingdom of Charlemagne to the kingdom of the Franks, and if you ultimately accompany the Pope to Rome, although it's anachronistically incorrect, you can even turn your kingdom into the Holy Roman Empire, which is just the type of fun that we love. Attila pretty much said, survive till this date. Attila is born. Attila is coming for you, now your crops are failing. Not really inspiring stuff, and I think we can see and safely say that Age of Charlemagne took a much better approach. But it's not just Charlemagne and the Franks. All of the other factions have just great personality and are brimming with uniqueness. At no point do the Lombards and Muslims just feel like foils for the Charlemagne Empire. So what's this? I think we might have some replayability here. But hold on, we've only talked about factions, and I've already established that the Grand Campaign had awesome factions as well. So what else has changed? The answer is heaps. The overall interface feedback was vastly improved, providing more breakout boxes and explanations that explain many of the mysterious mechanics, and also diplomacy became much more responsive, with the enemy actually interested in peace and non-aggression pacts. Meanwhile, having more visibility over the Imperium system so people can more clearly make choices would allow you to obtain victory through research and building as opposed to just mere conquest. Age of Charlemagne also introduced war wariness, which creates civil strife if you are at war with too many factions for too long. This can be reduced by closing off wars with peace or total annihilation, bringing troops home, and while it's not perfect, it is a far more palatable way to slow down the Empire's expansion than the horrible sanitation mechanic. Speaking of which, it's gone! Well, at least in the way it was in Attila's Grand Campaign. It still exists as a side item to manage, but it's not the revolt generator it previously was, and again, this is just a great change to take an overinflated mechanic and scale it down into a more suitable role. The building system was simplified, and more of them are actually useful because you can now use some creativity when building your empire. Another area where Creative Assembly absolutely listened was regarding the Raze spam of Attila, which was actually removed completely. Someone had their finger on the pulse here, because in Total War Attila's Grand Campaign, you feel like the only person on the entire map trying to build anything, and Charlemagne was a true conquest and civil administration game that addressed every major grievance. Well, small factions will still sail away from you, but on the whole, Total War is doing what Total War does much better this time. The fresh time setting really allowed CA to wash their hands, start clean, and they absolutely capitalized on this opportunity. Also, religion doesn't suck anymore. Thank God. Attila's treatment of religion was the worst in the series. I mean, churches that cost money and don't inflate public order, it was the most poorly veiled method of ensuring the Roman Empire would collapse to civil strife, revolts, and just make sure that things pan out that way. But in Age of Charlemagne, churches give public order, which can be projected onto neighboring provinces as well, and they don't cost you anything. Once again, we're seeing game mechanics that reward the player through sustained investment, unlike the base game, which is just repeating the same tasks so you don't slip backwards. So, did Age of Charlemagne deliver on its December 2015 release? Would it save Attila from declining further than the 3,000 player mark? Well, in December 2015, Total War Attila would break over the 5,000 concurrent players for the first time since its release. More importantly, Total War Attila would maintain an average of 5,500 players all the way to the release of Total War Warhammer in May of 2016, and during this final run, the Slavic Nations pack would be released in February of 2016, but going off other cultural packs, this likely only contributed to a few hundred players. To give further context, prior to Age of Charlemagne dropping, the combination of Rome 2 and Attila's player base averaged about 30% Attila, and this would shift up to around 40% and sustain this number for close to the 2 years that followed it. Whether it brought back old fans, brought in new fans, this was the shot in the arm the title needed to stay more than relevant until Warhammer's release, which would be its effective release cycle. And it's also worth mentioning as well that the modding teams do a great job in keeping these games alive, and this gave them a ton of new content and possibilities. In the 2 years after Warhammer dropped, Rome 2 would maintain a steady average of nearly 6,000 players, and Attila would steadily hold on to over 3,000 players for that same 2-year period, even with Total Warhammer 2 competing with the final 6 months of that time span. Overall, Age of Charlemagne was a massive risk, jumping several hundred years ahead in time to a time period that is nowhere near as popular as the classic Roman or the medieval period. But what CA delivered was an actual campaign that did what we wanted of a sequel: innovative improvements on the existing Total War formula with enough intrigue to keep us coming back for more. More importantly is something I think we see in even Total Warhammer 2's recent content, which is mechanics that offer more opportunity rather than mitigate risk and suffering, that which actually give the players some kind of tangible reward. They literally listen to the players by going as far as removing racing settlements completely from this game and allowed more flexible narratives, which was the complaint of the last Roman DLC. This allowed them to deliver a campaign which was embedded in history and finally gave Total War Attila a truly fun and replayable grand campaign. Since its release, Age of Charlemagne has almost become a buzzword for good Total War DLC, and if you do get Attila, I highly recommend getting this title as well. And that's it for this analysis. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like more content like this, please just mention in the comments any questions you have. I answer and appreciate everything. And this is Oven Plot Armor. I'll see you next time. Cheers.